Welcome back to Educator.com. This is the lesson on the heart. When we look at the anatomy of the heart, there are several layers that we need to consider. The pericardium is technically not the heart itself, but what you can see here is it's kind of cut away. You see it says pericardium cut away, is this connective tissue sac that in a person's thoracic cavity, if you were to open them up, you would see it almost looks like saran wrap, more opaque than that, but around the entire beating heart. And that particular connective tissue sac is not only protecting the heart and giving it some extra layered cushioning, but in between the pericardium and the surface of the heart itself is fluid. And that's providing lubrication. Think of it as like, the engine of your car. Without oil in the engine, with all those moving parts that are metal on metal, it wouldn't work quite as well. There'd be too much friction. So having that fluid in between the inside of the pericardium and the surface of the heart, very important. The epicardium, remember epi means superficial when we're talking about organs on the outside. The epicardium is the actual surface of the heart, very thin in terms of the rest of the layers. When we go deeper, the myocardium, the thickest layer of the heart by far, is all that muscle, that cardiac muscle, very thick. If you've ever cut into a sheep heart or cow heart, which would be a lot bigger in some kind of dissection lab, the myocardium is very thick. And it's important. You want it to be strong. You want it to last a lifetime and do the job of making blood move. The endocardium is that inner layer, the deepest layer of the heart tissue. It's very smooth, like a slip and slide. Very smooth, made of epithelium, and you can call it endothelium because it's very deep. That's what the blood itself is slipping and sliding along. And you want it to be smooth. If the endocardium was rough, it would damage or rupture too many red blood cells. So you want it to be nice and smooth for this process to work properly. Atria and ventricles are the main chambers of the heart. You can see here, this is the right atrium. From this view, it's hard to see the left atrium. It's over here. They say auricle of the left atrium. That's just the little corner of it. If we turn the heart slightly, you would be able to see the left atrium a lot better. But those are the most superior, smaller chambers of the heart. If we go deeper, you would see the right and left ventricle, larger chambers. The way that I keep it straight in terms of right and left is you just got to keep in mind that this is from the point of view of the person whose heart this belongs to. From my point of view, if you looked at the heart, my left ventricle is on that side. Now I know it's your right, but we got to keep in mind it's from the point of view of the subject. So that's why even though in the left side of the drawing, this is called the right atrium, the right ventricle would be in here. So just keep that in mind. If we were looking from the posterior side, looking from behind, then your left would be the same left as the subject. The coronary arteries is a general term for these blood vessels that supply the heart muscle tissue itself with blood. This is an interesting thing to think about. The heart itself needs blood as well. So yes, the heart's role is to circulate blood to the entire body, to all the cells that need it. But if the heart itself does not get blood, it won't get the nourishment. It won't get the sugars and gases it needs to be able to keep providing the sugars and gases to the rest of the body. So the coronary artery is very important. You have blood flow coming out of the inside of what's called the aorta to get all of that blood inside of those muscle fibers. If you get a clog, if you get a blockage in the coronary arteries, you can get a heart attack. There are arteries and veins coming out from the top portion, the superior portion of the heart. The major one is the aorta. That is the major artery that's sending blood to the body. And then there are veins as well. We'll get to those in more detail in future slides in this lesson. And lastly, fat. All of this yellow stuff. Yeah, that's lipid, that's fat. And you're going to see it on the surface of the heart. You're also going to see it around the outside of the heart, especially around the pericardium, as a cushioning. You want to cushion it in the thoracic cavity. It's a very precious organ. You don't want it to get damaged, so having some of that fat is a nice little buffer, cushion. Now the fat on the outside here, I don't want you to think this person is unhealthy. It's normal to have some fat on the outside. The fat you don't want is inside of the coronary arteries. So when we look at how blood flows through the heart, it should be a one-way trip, meaning, or one-way street rather is a better way to say it. You do not want backflow, and we'll talk more later about what the backflow is and how that happens. When we start with blood coming back from the body into the heart, it's the vena cava that's taking blood from above the heart, from below the heart, back into it. And you want the blood going back in the heart so it can send it to the lungs, where you can exhale CO2 that's accumulated in the blood, get O2 back in the blood, and then send that back out to the body. So the vena cava is here and here. You can see it's on the right side of the heart. Remember, the right is actually your left when we're looking at this person's heart. This is the inferior vena cava, which is taking deoxygenated blood, has more of a blue look to it, from all of those veins that are below the heart, taking all that back into this chamber. And then this is the, of course, superior vena cava, taking deoxygenated blood from the areas above the heart into this chamber. This is the right atrium. So once blood enters the right atrium, there is a little doorway that separates this chamber from the right ventricle. This doorway is called the tricuspid valve, because when you look down on this valve, these little flaps that open and close, it looks like this, kind of like a Mercedes symbol. This is a cusp, this is a cusp, and that's a cusp. So all these flaps, there's 3 of them. That's why it's a tricuspid valve. The right ventricle, larger chamber, if that tricuspid valve opens and this chamber contracts or squeezes, blood's going to enter into here. And you can see that associated with each of the valves are these little strands called chordae tendineae. I'll tell you more about those in a bit. Once blood enters the right ventricle and then the right ventricle squeezes, it's going to shoot it up through the pulmonary valve. The word pulmonary always has to do with lungs. So this valve is going to be allowing blood to pass through it and then eventually go on to the lungs. The pulmonary arteries are those blood vessels that are taking blood to the left and right lung. And you can see that there's 2 parts of it. It's like a fork in the road. This one goes to the left, this one goes to the right. Arteries are always leaving the heart, taking blood away from the heart. I've heard students have a misconception before, and I used to have this misconception as a student, that arteries are red, veins are blue. In the systemic circuit, going to and from the body, that is true, but it's flipped in the lungs. When you take blood away from the heart to the lungs, it's actually bluish because it's lacking oxygen. When you go to the lungs and pick up that oxygen and take the blood back to the heart, those veins have red blood. So just remember, arteries are always leaving the heart, veins going to the heart. And yes, the lungs is the next destination. Let's go to the next slide to see the rest of the sequence on the left side of the heart. The sequence of blood flow from the lungs back to the heart is going to take oxygenated blood, see this pink arrow, through the left pulmonary vein and through the right pulmonary vein into this chamber over here. This is the left atrium. Now I know this little red guy here looks like it's coming into the right side of the heart, perhaps. No. If you look carefully, this particular vein coming from the right lung goes just behind these other blood vessels and does connect right here to the interior of the left atrium. Blood passing through the left atrium into the left ventricle is going to go through, once again, another valve that prevents backflow. And that valve is called the bicuspid valve because this particular valve has only 2 cusps, not 3. A nickname for this valve is the mitral valve, and I'll explain why. So the mitral valve is the same thing as the bicuspid valve. Someone who named this was very creative in terms of their imagination. They thought that this valve reminded them of a mitre, and a mitre is one of those bishop or pope hats. You may be familiar with this. You know, one of these kinds of hats. There's the little skull cap part, and here's the guy. Hair. Anyways, you know, those 2 parts of the hat, something about this valve reminded them of that. So you can call it bicuspid or mitral, whatever works. And textbooks usually will refer to both terms. So that particular valve is controlling backflow so that when this left ventricle squeezes, when it contracts, you don't want blood going backwards, back up into the left atrium. You want it going out through the aorta. And there is a valve that prevents blood from going back into the left atrium once it's reached this blood vessel. So the left ventricle, when it squeezes, blood goes through this particular valve here. It's hard to see, but it also has 3 cusps. The aortic valve is going to lead to the aorta, the largest, strongest artery in terms of its thickness in the body. The aorta, in the average person, is about the thickness of a garden hose. Picture a garden hose right there, looping above your heart. That's crazy to think about, but you want it to be tough. You want it to be strong because blood is rocketing out of the heart through that. You do not want it to tear. And it's very unlikely that the aorta is going to tear because it is so strong, but really severe trauma, something like a car accident, could tear it. And a tear in the aorta could cause someone to die very quickly because the amount of blood that would be coming out would be quite a lot in terms of how quickly it would exit that blood vessel. And yes, the body is the next destination. You could see that the aorta, it has these little arteries that come out from the top of it superiorly, taking blood to the arms, taking blood up into the head. And then the rest of the blood goes down what's called the descending aorta, which goes behind the heart and is going to split up into all the major arteries going to the rest of the body. I have this simplified blood flow diagram that I drew because when we look at the heart and how twisty and turny it is, sometimes it's hard to remember what leads to what. And I'm going to give you some hints and abbreviations here that will help. So I'm going to use blue for the left side. Keep in mind this is a boxy depiction. This is not anatomically accurate in terms of the space involved, in terms of the angles and such. But the sequence is going to still be the same. Here is the superior vena cava. Here is the inferior vena cava. And that's going to be taking blue blood, deoxygenated blood, back into the heart. That's why I'm using blue here. So they both lead into here. Here is the right atrium. And of course, this little doorway is the tricuspid valve. That leads into the larger chamber that's inferior to the right atrium, the right ventricle. And here's a hint for remembering what side the tricuspid valve is on. TV, RV. You can watch TV in your RV. Huh? So that's the way that you can remember it. The tricuspid valve is preventing backflow from the right ventricle into the right atrium. And since this is taking blood to the lungs, because it's blue, you want to get that oxygen back, you can call this the pulmonary valve. Remember that the blood is going this way. So the pulmonary valve leads to the pulmonary arteries, because this is taking blood away from the heart. Here is the sorry, I just made the mistake. Here's the left, pulmonary artery, and here's the right pulmonary artery. So that blood goes to the lungs, gets rid of the CO2 that's in it so you can exhale it, picks up the oxygen. When that oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, which you're going to hear more about in the blood lessons, it becomes red. So how do we get back into the heart? We're now on the superior left side. This would be the left pulmonary vein, and over here, because it's going kind of behind the heart into this region of the atrium, this would be the right pulmonary vein. And both of those blood vessels lead into, of course, LA, the left atrium. And remember, this one's not tricuspid like over here. It only has 2 cusps. So this is the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. And down here is the left ventricle. This is the largest chamber in the heart. It's slightly larger than the right ventricle. Depending on what anatomical image you see with cross sections through it, depending on how anterior or posterior they are, sometimes the right ventricle will appear larger, depending on what angle and what part of the heart you're cutting through, but left ventricle, slightly bigger than the right ventricle. And of course the blood flow comes into here, comes through here, and then it's going to go up. Once the left ventricle contracts, this is the aortic valve, and that takes blood into the aorta. And you know what? I should have done that a little further down, but now I just did. The blood going through here, if you kind of think of how the aorta comes up and has that little loop that goes down, this looks like an A. If you look at how the left pulmonary artery kind of goes in front of it. So that's a nice way to remember that A for aorta, that major blood vessel taking oxygenated blood to the entire body. And remember, there's also arteries that branch off from the top. So there's a simplified blood flow diagram for you. When we look at heartbeats and the valves and how the actual sound of the heart corresponds to the valves closing and opening, a lot of textbooks will refer to the bump, 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 bump as lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. And the sound is actually corresponding to the valves closing. Lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. Looks like a dance or something. Lub-dub, lub-dub. The first sound is actually these valves closing. So the lub is these two. These are known as atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. And the way to remember that is they are separating the atria and the ventricles. Atria, ventricles. So atrioventricular valves separate the A and the V. That's why they are AV valves. Bicuspid and mitral, or bicuspid and tricuspid. The other two, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, are semilunar valves, named after like kind of a half moon term. So semilunar valves is these two. And so these close together and these close together. And you can see that when the AV valves are open, these are going to be closed. When these are open, these are going to close. This picture, by the way, if you're wondering which one is it, is the aortic valve. But you know what? The tricuspid and pulmonary valves look very similar. So think about it this way. The lub start with the valves that are kind of higher up, or higher up's not the best term, but the ones that happen kind of first in terms of thinking about blood coming in. So remember, blood coming into the heart on either side, it's going to pass through these valves first. So think about them closing first in terms of this sequence of lub and dub. And because these two close for that first sound, they close when the ventricles squeeze. Why do they close when the ventricles squeeze? Because if you imagine blood pooling into these parts, and boom, the walls just compact together, you want blood to go which way? This way and this way, not back. You don't want it to go backwards into the atria. So when this contracts, these two, the bicuspid and tricuspid, or AV valves, have to close. Conversely, when these are relaxed and you want blood coming out of the atria down into the ventricles, you want these to be open. And you also want these to be closed at that time because you've just squeezed blood out of the ventricles and you want it to stay on its way to the lungs and on its way to the body in these blood vessels. So you have to have that coordinated opening and closing. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Systole and diastole. When we look at the term systole, that's basically like saying contraction. So when the ventricles contract, they are in ventricular systole. Diastole is the opposite. So when the ventricles relax, it's ventricular diastole. And when ventricular contraction or systole is happening, you're going to get the atria doing the opposite, and vice versa. So you can use the term atrial systole, atrial diastole. And so it's contraction, versus relaxation. And the chambers are going to relax when they're ready to receive blood. Think about the ventricles. When they've just shot blood out of the heart, they then need to be ready to accept blood from the atria. So they're going to relax and open up, get the blood pooling in there, and then, once again, systole. The way that I keep these straight is blood pressure terms. Like the blood pressure 120/80, that's systolic over diastolic. That higher number corresponds to higher pressure, contraction. So systole, that higher number, 120 or whatever the systolic number on blood pressure would be for a person, is going to be a higher number because it's contraction rather than that relaxation, which is going to be lower pressure. The valves respond to the pressure changes. I told you I would tell you more about those little tendons. There's little kind of like white strands associated with the valves as they open and close. So as ventricular pressure rises, boom, as they contract above the atrial pressure, that causes the AV valves to be pushed closed. And then when the ventricles relax and they expand, that pulls on those little white tendons. They're called chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae. Now remember, tendons connect muscle to bone. These are a little bit different than your average tendon because it's connecting valves, part of the endothelium of the heart, to other parts of the endothelium that are all connected to the myocardium, the heart muscle itself. So as the pressure changes because of the contraction and relaxation, that's going to open and close the valves because these are attached to those little flaps. Cardiac output, you're going to hear more about that in blood pressure, parts of the blood vessel lessons. But cardiac output is a measurement of how much blood is physically leaving the heart. Stroke volume is milliliters of blood that leave the heart with each ventricular contraction or ventricular systole. So how much blood is physically leaving, and then of course, how often is it leaving? Heart rate, are we talking 60 beats per minute, which is resting heart rate for a lot of people? Are we talking 130 beats per minute, which is when somebody's typically, doing some running? It could even be a lot higher than that. So cardiac output could be increased by having just a lot higher heart rate. Just having your heart beat faster, the amount of blood coming out of the heart would increase, of course. But if you can increase stroke volume, you don't have to have as much of a heart rate increase. So how do you increase stroke volume? Exercising. Lots and lots of exercising. If somebody gets to the point where their heart is super efficient in terms of how much blood it can actually squeeze out of it with each beat, you'll find that their resting heart rate tends to drop. Because when they're at rest, their body doesn't need to have as many contractions. Because with each contraction, they're actually squeezing out a lot more squeezing out a lot more blood, rather. Here's a depiction of the cardiac cycle in terms of pressure in the aorta, pressure in the ventricles, how much blood is in the ventricles. And then this is showing you an ECG, electrocardiogram, and then a phonocardiogram in terms of the sounds coming out of the heart. So aortic pressure related to ventricular pressure. Let's look at this. So when you get the ventricle, boom, contracting, doing systole, that's when you get this blue whoop, a big rise. And that corresponds to ejection, letting go of blood out of the ventricles. And of course, that's going to increase the amount of pressure in the aorta because where's this blood going when the ventricle contracts? It's going in the aorta, sending the blood to the rest of the body. At the same time, when the ventricle, boom, squeezes, that's why this red line drops. As soon as this rises, boom, the amount of blood in the ventricle lessens because that blood is leaving the ventricles. And you're going to see more about this later on in the lesson. What is this little bump? The bump, the all those heart monitors, what does that mean? We're going to get to that in a sec. But I just wanted to show you how it's all related here in terms of when the ventricles are squeezing and letting blood out of them. And at the same time, look, when the ventricles go back to diastole in terms of kind of relaxing, the pressure lessens, and then once they're opened up again and waiting for blood, what's going to happen? Ventricular volume is going to increase because the atria on the top are squeezing blood back into the ventricles, and then it's going to happen all over again. And this just happens in a matter of 2 to 3 seconds, or even less if the heart rate is very fast. When it comes to initiating a heartbeat, it's really fascinating within the heart. Automaticity, this term here means that this is the one place in the body where electrical signaling happens apart from neurons initiating it. So you get movement of this amazing organ without neurons specifically being inside of it. A misconception some students will have is they think that the cardiac conduction system is a bunch of neurons or nerves within the heart. That's not true. There are pathways within the tissue of the heart, within these muscle fiber tracts that guide the electricity through it. And that's described as the cardiac conduction system. So it does describe how electrical signaling makes its way through the heart in a coordinated fashion. We hope it's coordinated. The sinoatrial or SA node is this little bluish purple dot right there. So I'm going to underline that in blue. That's located in the kind of superior wall of the right atrium. This is kind of an interesting looking drawing, and here's that exposed right atrium. In this particular shot, we can't see the left atrium very effectively, but left atrium does not have as much to do with starting up the heartbeat. This sinoatrial node, extremely important because this is the natural pacemaker of your heart. If you've ever heard of somebody having a pacemaker, that's an artificial pacemaker where we've attached an electrical device to the heart that helps initiate the heartbeat in a proper way. So if somebody is having some trouble with their SA node working naturally, you then attach a pacemaker to it to keep it in check. So this is the natural pacemaker that we are born with. And some people have no trouble with this pacemaker their entire lives. It's doing the proper, coordinated, well-paced set of contractions and relaxations that's supposed to happen. So there is, yes, a nerve that comes and stimulates the SA node, and then once that's stimulated, it's off to the races in terms of the electrical signal flowing through the heart in the right way. So the SA node then sends a signal into here, the AV node. So this is more in the kind of inferior part of the right atrium. I'm going to do that in red. The atrioventricular node. And remember the term AV valve from the previous slide? AV node has its name because you can see that if it's on the inferior part of the atrium, that's going to be adjacent to the opening to the ventricle. So that's why it's called AV node. It's very close to the opening to the ventricle. And here, once again, is a good image of the chordae tendineae right there. The AV bundle then takes the signal down through the septum, meaning the border between the left ventricle and right ventricle, and it extends in what are called Purkinje fibers. So all these little fibers that are kind of innervating the muscle fibers of the ventricles, named after Dr. Purkinje, and those Purkinje fibers, when the electrical signal goes through all those, you get the ventricles, the left and right, contracting at the same time. At least they're supposed to. And if you're wondering about, well, what about the left atrium? Because of signals going through the SA node, it's able to simultaneously stimulate through these little tracts, the atria contracting at just about the same time. And so this sequence is able to get the atria and ventricles contracting in a coordinated fashion to make sure that blood is flowing properly and efficiently through the heart. An EKG or ECG stands for electrocardiogram. So the English abbreviation would be ECG. EKG comes from the German for cardio. You can use either one. EKG and ECG is the same thing. This is a measurement of the electrical events within the heart. And when we look at one single boop, boop, there are a few different points. They call them waves. The P wave, let's do that in red, right here. This has to do with the atria being depolarized. And depolarization of the atria is going to make it do atrial systole, that contraction. So here is atrial depolarization. So that is going to make the left and right atria contract. And you notice it's a little hump. It's a little change in the electricity ending up flowing through that part compared to this, because the QRS, that's the ventricles. So you ever wondered, why is this bump not as high? Well, ventricles, much larger in terms of them being this holder of blood and like a muscular chamber that's going to be in a much stronger way squeezing blood out of the heart. And so the size of those ventricles and the amount of electricity flowing through them is going to be a bit bigger. So the QRS complex, that as a whole, from this point up here and down, this is ventricular depolarization. All of this. If you remember the terms repolarization and depolarization from action potentials, it has to do with this. Remember that with an action potential, it goes up and down, similar to this, where it's depolarization, repolarization in terms of sodium and potassium. You can kind of use those terms here to help you remember that it's depolarization, then repolarization. Sodium going into the neuron, potassium leaving the neuron, having depolarization, repolarization. This whole thing here, just itself, is depolarization. After it, you have repolarization. That gets the ventricles back into their relaxed state. It gets them in ventricular diastole. So T here, the T wave, is actually the event that repolarizes the ventricles, eventually getting them ready for receiving more blood. So this is ventricular, I'm just saying vent repolarization. If you're wondering, what happened to atrial repolarization? I don't see that here. It's covered by QRS. So the repolarization of the atria actually happens during this span of time, but the electrical signals of the ventricles just outweigh it by far. So on a ECG, you're going to notice this overlapping that. So in terms of arrhythmias, I want to show you how this ECG reading can vary and how a doctor can interpret it in terms of what's going on within the heart. So first one is, let's say that we have this and then okay, what you're seeing here is, instead of there being a nice flat line between the heartbeats, you see squigglies and then QRS, squigglies, QRS, squigglies, QRS. What are these squigglies? That's called atrial fibrillation. The atria, instead of having nice coordinated contractions and relaxations, they're kind of not doing it very well. This is not necessarily deadly. It's something that you obviously don't want to have happening, but as long as the ventricles are getting enough blood going in them and doing a great job of squeezing, which it looks like they are, people can live a long time with some atrial fibrillation, meaning their atria are not doing the best job, but at least you got the QRS wave. Something else that can happen is, let's say you have the normal flat line between beats and then this. Okay, notice here that the QRS is not that big. It's really not that much bigger than the P or T. This means you could have a weakening of the ventricles. They're not doing as good of a job as having those profound systoles, those contractions getting blood exiting. And that could be a problem. Here's another one. Actually, I should do it even bigger. Yeah, there we go. Notice that's, I kind of ran into that drawing, but that's a lot bigger of a QRS complex. I could have exaggerated even a little more. This is a sign of an enlarged heart. And at first you might think, well, larger heart, yay, it's doing even better, right? It's bigger. An enlarged heart having an enlargement of the ventricle mass, of the ventricle muscle, is actually counterproductive. An enlarged heart, I've also heard the term athlete's heart to describe it. Getting an enlarged heart there actually can make the ventricle chambers smaller. So its ability to get blood exiting the heart efficiently, it's going to get in the way of cardiac output. So having an enlarged heart, not necessarily a good thing. And there are plenty of other arrhythmias in terms of the spacing between the P and the S, spacing between the S and the T, and that could signal problems in the cardiac conduction system, that the electrical signal from SA to AV is somehow not going as quickly as it should, or from the AV down the bundle through the septum into the Purkinje fibers. If any of those are delayed, you could have problems with the coordination of your heartbeat. And also, there's other things like tachycardia, bradycardia, which have to do with too high of a heart rate, too low of a heart rate, and we'll cover that at the end of this lesson. Heart conditions and treatments. A myocardial infarction, or an MI, is something you might hear in certain medical shows or shows involving doctors or something in a hospital. That's a heart attack. So myocardial infarction, a technical term for a heart attack. The way that happens is a blockage in a coronary artery is going to cut off blood flow to part of the heart tissue, and it's going to cause death of some of that heart tissue within the myocardium. You can survive a heart attack, but the more heart attacks a person gets, the more you are permanently damaging heart tissue. And the more heart attacks, the more likely it is that the next one's going to be fatal. There are interesting bits of research leading us into how to regenerate heart muscle in an area of the heart that's died off because of a heart attack. I've read that injecting stem cells into mouse hearts or rat hearts that have had myocardial infarctions have shown promise. So I think we'll eventually get to the point where we will be able to bring back dead heart tissue. But of course, diet, exercise are going to be those things that you do have control over right now. Angina pectoris is not quite heart attack. Angina pectoris has to do with a lessening of adequate blood flow through those coronary arteries. So you do have periods of time, if somebody has angina, where the heart is not getting as much blood as it should. And typically someone with angina, if they get really stressed out, really angry, or do too much physical activity, the increase in blood pressure and the constricting the coronary arteries is going to cause them a lot of pain, because it's not quite an MI, but you're restricting blood flow to the parts of the heart that need blood in order to contract effectively. One of the treatments for angina pectoris is something like nitroglycerin. I've heard sprays under the tongue. There's probably other ways to deliver it into the body, but it will actually lower the blood pressure, which will make all those coronary arteries expand a little bit, and then more blood can then get to the heart. Interestingly enough, a little blue pill that people are familiar with, which is actually for erectile dysfunction, is related to this. One of the active ingredients in medications that treat angina pectoris, since it lowers blood pressure and actually expands the vessels, getting more blood flow, they noticed one of the side effects of treatment of angina was the males would get erections now and then. So taking that active ingredient and playing with it in terms of what tissue it targets, that led to that pill that helps with ED, because it's expanding blood vessels and helping get blood flow into the penis, and that's $1 billion industry. Pericarditis is actually an infection or irritation of the pericardium, that sac around the heart. So it can get just really irritated because of trauma, or an infection could harm that, and over time that could definitely have a negative impact on the heart, which is inside of it. Coronary artery disease is what's going to lead to an MI. Coronary artery disease is when you get buildup of plaques that are constricting the amount of blood that can go through those blood vessels. That's something that's not good to get. And of course, like I mentioned, diet and exercise very important. And angioplasty, one of the most common ones I've heard of is a balloon angioplasty, where they actually will go through the femoral artery in the leg, and they will insert this little metal kind of like catheter, and it goes all the way up into the aorta, and they go up around the that little loop into a coronary artery where they have a blockage, and then they will actually go into the coronary artery that has the plaque, and then expand a balloon that will actually press that plaque out of the way, and it gets that interior part of the blood vessel expanded and opened. And that's fascinating to think about, that they can actually increase blood flow and make it less likely that person's going to get an MI in the near future. So it's something that's not a permanent fix. If that person continues to eat a high-fat diet, especially high-saturated fat, and doesn't exercise, they're going to get that buildup of plaque again. It's not going to cure the problem. Coronary artery bypass graft. If you ever heard somebody getting a triple bypass or quadruple bypass, when they do a surgery to take an artery and kind of go around where there's a blockage, you can have up to 4 at once be done. So a quadruple bypass is a major thing because they're making a little loop for blood to bypass, literally go around a blockage in the road that's taking blood into the heart muscle. And that graft can definitely extend someone's life significantly. Amazingly, some people, better than others, will naturally do this in their heart. Some people just go 90, 100 years without getting a heart attack because where they had a blockage, their body can actually naturally bypass, go around that blockage. Some people do it better than others. Tachycardia versus bradycardia. This means really high heart rate versus really low. Now, tachycardia is acceptable if you're exercising, right? If you're running, if you're doing a marathon, you're going to have a high heart rate. So tachycardia in that instance, expected. Bradycardia, if you're at rest, you would expect to have a very low heart rate. But if you're tachycardic, if this is happening when you're at rest, that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, it might be stress. It might be something that's causing that to happen that's very unhealthy, though. So you want, if you're tachycardic when you're sitting down, you want to go to a doctor and get that checked out. And it may be stress that's causing that. Bradycardia, having too few heartbeats in a span of time. Like I said, when you're at rest, it's expected, but you want your heart rate to increase if you are asking your body to do more. That's how you're going to get more blood flow into your skeletal muscles. Fibrillation is something that is going to be accompanied with that MI, or fibrillation is associated with it. And what I mean by that is if you have cutoff of blood flow into a significant part of the ventricular muscle, instead of it being this nice coordinated set of PQRST, it's going to look like this. That's not effectively contracting ventricles and contracting and relaxing the atria. This is what a heart attack can look like, and that's called fibrillation. So an AED, an automatic external defibrillator, is the clear, and that's trying to kind of reboot the heart in terms of the electric flow, trying to get it back into this proper, the PQRS complex. So an automatic external defibrillator is the opposite of fibrillation. Defibrillating is trying to get rid of that fibrillation so it has a nice coordinated set of contractions. Now, if someone is flatlining, just beep, no electricity flowing through the heart, the chances of an AED getting them back is extremely low. It's possible, so they're still going to try to get that person back, but generally an AED is most effective in getting a person out of fibrillation. A heart murmur is when one or more of the valves that control blood flow so that it goes in one direction isn't working properly. So if those valves, whether the AV valves or the semilunar valves, are not completely closing when they should, you can get kind of a regurgitation, blood flow going backwards. So a heart murmur, if you go to a cardiologist and they listen to your heart sounds with a stethoscope, they're trained and they have tons of experience where they can hear the little bits of backflow in a heart murmur. And, I don't have that trained ear, but I'm exaggerating this for you. But, a heartbeat to them would sound like bum, 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 bum. And if we exaggerated what a heart murmur sounds like, it could be like bum, 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 because that sound is blood backflowing, going backwards, maybe back into the ventricle from the aorta, or some of it ends up staying behind in the atria rather than going from atria to ventricle. So a heart murmur, sometimes If it's significant enough over time, that can shorten a lifespan. And surgeries can replace them or fix them. They actually will use pig heart valves oftentimes to replace heart valves in a human, and that works fine. You do have to take drugs to kind of calm down your immune system so you don't attack that tissue, but hey, it works. Mitral valve prolapse is when part of the mitral valve is actually like going, it's kind of curved into the atrium, and mitral valve prolapse over time, it's not something that's efficient in terms of the mitral valve closing when it's supposed to prevent backflow. So these are some of the heart conditions and treatments involved with keeping a person alive and minimizing problems with the heart. So thanks for watching Educator.com.